When we realized that in our society, the policing system and system of mass incarceration, the unjust judicial system that we have are part of something much bigger, right? These are not just random isolated forms of racism, but they're part of a longer history of racism in our society.
When we say systemic racism, we're thinking about laws that are put into place. We're thinking about policies that are made at city and state and neighborhood levels. We're thinking about language that goes into company disciplinary documents to help shape how they want their employees to behave. We're thinking system level, right? When we say systemic. And why is it systemic? Because it's almost self-perpetuating. So once you put a policy or a practice or a law into works, it almost works automatically because folks accept it as normal. They don't really challenge it. And it becomes a system that seemingly is operating automatically, but we know it's people pushing it on, but they're doing so because they are not challenging, nor are they taught to challenge, nor is the challenge accepted to kind of challenge those systems that are put into place. Policy, law, these kinds of things.
Literally, you have to go all the way back to how this country was formed, right? Literally on the genocide and the forcible removal of indigenous people and on the enslavement of African people, right? Literally everything flows out of that. When Europeans came to this country, the goal wasn't just to be mean to Black people or to Native Americans. It was about gaining wealth and power. It was a selfish, right, reasoning for doing these things, gaining control of land and all these things. And out of that, to be able to have that kind of power meant to control and dominate other people, and dominate and control their resources and their opportunities and the way that they can move and live in a world. And then you have to justify that kind of discrimination. So you have to have ideologies and myths that justify why it's okay to do this to some people because either they're less human or they're dangerous or they're criminal. So all these things, it's this large myth stories, when I say myths, right? Large stories that have been told over and over again to justify why we can treat certain people as less than human and then act like it's not inhumane, and to have so that people who engage in this, whether it be directly or passively, right, however that they can sleep at night and still think of themselves as innocent, right? And so in the present day, after centuries of slavery, centuries of Jim Crow, convict leasing systems, sharecropping, peonage systems, terrorism, right? Literally Jim Crow terrorism, KKK and lynchings, all these things up to the 20th century, it's all been about power. At the heart of it, it's about power and control and creating policies and narratives and myths that can justify keeping, some people as have-nots and others as haves. And so all of a sudden you can see when Black people fled from the South and came up north during the Great Migration, even though white Northerners like to think of themselves as the innocent ones, what did? They forced Black people into ghettos, right? Under-resourced ghettos without access to jobs and livable wages, redlining folks into particular neighborhoods where they couldn't have, housing and opportunities to move wherever they wanted to. Public education was never equal to everybody else's education. There's just all these systems, right? Access to healthcare and all the things that neighborhoods need to flourish. All these things are being denied at a systematic level. And how does the police fit into that? They help to repress that, right? Often, if you go beyond just Law and Order TV shows of what we like to think police do, and then actually look at how they've functioned from slave patrols up to the present day, they've actually been used to repress and to over-police and to over-criminalize Black and brown people and poor people in general in their neighborhoods, rather than dealing with the structural issues that are actually causing some of these problems in the first place. And so, yeah, my kids, they're here in the city school district, in underfunded school, right? And meanwhile, you have schools that are literally overfunded across the state, right? And the state refusing, but people are unwilling to make those changes because they'll justify, oh, well, black people won't do right with it anyway, and I earned and I deserve this, right? And so there's these narratives and justifications for why it's okay to oppress people in that kind of way. The same thing, livable wages, right? We've seen for decades the suppression of wages over time. And this doesn't just impact black people, though certainly, of course, it disproportionately impacts black people, but it impacts all workers, right, across the board. And so the suppression of wages is another way in which we see a systemic implementation of economic discrimination, where, again, wealth is being pushed into the hands of the few, and masses of people are struggling, our middle class is shrinking. And so we could go on and on. Healthcare, right, in terms of the ways that healthcare, many people who need it most don't have access to affordable and adequate healthcare and preventative care, right? And of course, we can see in the disparities that black and brown people are disproportionately being impacted by that as well. And of course, even right now, in the midst of a pandemic happening right now, black and brown people dying disproportionately, right? For a whole variety of reasons, but that included is the inadequate healthcare and inadequate treatment when they actually even are getting healthcare in our systems as well.
If we think about systemic racism in education, we think about segregation and how schools with white students were much better funded and schools with black students were not. We think of desegregation and how teachers of color were disproportionately fired because the white teachers were allowed to keep their jobs when forced desegregation happened. So that's a system that I didn't individually participate in, but that system was built in that way. And if that system hasn't ever reckoned with fixing that origin, which I don't believe many of our systems have, then all of us participating in that system and not trying to change it, revolutionize it, or move it forward, then we are participating in a system that was built on racist foundations. And therefore, that's what systemic racism means, is that, yes, it's about individuals collectively, but just because we're not conscious of it or just because we don't identify our actions as being racist doesn't mean that we aren't perpetuating racism because we're participating in a system. You know, for me, the learning is, what does that look like in different systems I participate in? I use the example of education because it obviously is a system that I want to look at closely because it's the one I'm really closely aligned with, but we look at criminal justice systems. Obviously, the conversation right now is around criminal justice systems from start to stop. And you look at the pipeline and how schools participate in criminal justice systems and how students of color and especially black men and women of color in our school systems are disproportionately expelled, disproportionately suspended, and then put into a pipeline that leads to disproportionate incarceration down the road. So that's systemic racism. So from the teacher not knowing and not keeping track of how many students am I kicking out, how many students am I disciplining formally, and is it proportionate, they're unconsciously perpetuating a system that was likely set up to advantage them if they're white and disadvantage a student if that student is anything other than white, frankly.
When we talk about, let's say someone is exhibiting racist behavior, is that systemic racism? I say it derives from systemic racism because you, as an individual person, cannot enact an entire system, but you can depend on the system in order to kind of understand and carry out your own behavior as an individual person, So while all individual behaviors are not systemic, folks can hearken back to the system in order to rely on and be affirmed by a system that will enable their racist behavior. And that is why Ibram X. Kendi, I didn't like the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, but the concepts in the book are fabulous. Because he develops a way of thinking about racism that's really important. He talks about being anti-racist, the work, having anti-racist thinking and anti-racist behaviors versus just calling somebody a racist, right? Because when we call somebody a racist, it's, people are offended, even though I think some people are actually racist, but another story. But when we call somebody a racist, it doesn't really get at the heart of what is racist, right? Because people will tell you in a second, well, I'm not racist, I have black friends. Well, maybe that part isn't racist, but what about these other behaviors that are? And I think Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, gets at that idea. You have to practice anti-racist behavior, and we all can challenge ourselves, whether we are, no matter what race we ascribe to work towards anti-racist behavior. So some examples of anti-racist behavior can be, depending on what your station is in the community, whether you ascribe to the dominant culture or whether you are of a minority population, your anti-racist behavior can be calling out certain policies or procedures that you see as not benefiting the community in an equitable way. For example, if you know that a bank lender, for example, has historically had an issue with lending to populations equally, gathering a community group to find out why, because they're supposed to serve the community and serve the community equitably, and finding out what that is. That's attacking anti-racist behavior. Challenging how your friends speak. If you have a friend who is constantly saying they're uncomfortable around minorities, challenge them and find out why. If they're constantly talking over minorities when they're telling them their issue or their pain or their suffering, challenge them and find out why. Because a lot of racism and racist behavior is covert. It's not it's covert, it's learned and it's ingrained, and it becomes a part of us in a way that it feels really hard and cutting for somebody to be like, you're a racist. It feels really hard and was traumatic.
We sometimes miss that the real function of racism is not about personal prejudice. It's about how we organize our society. And so if we pay attention to how we actually are organizing our society in terms of funding and who has access to resources, right, and who has access to housing and livable wages and all these things, then we see bigger problems and issues. And that's why we can have a deeper conversation then around mass incarceration in our judicial system and policing, when we actually see that these are widespread problems rather than just bad apples or random incidents, right? These are not random incidents in terms of police killings. These are the inevitable things that are going to happen when you have over-policing of black and brown neighborhoods the way that we do, and we criminalize black and brown people for every minor infraction and broken window practices, right, of policing and things like that. And so we've got to look at these bigger assumptions that shape our policies and practices, our institutions all across our society, and be committed to actually changing the way that we organize our society. And I'll get back to that in a second in terms of what some of that looks like. But I think the other narrative, just one higher than that, which often gets lost, is the narrative level. It's the myths and the stories and the values that we run by, because that cultural level is really powerful. And so we actually have to tell a more truthful story. And that's what we've struggled to do in the United States. We've never actually been able to tell a truthful story about our foundations of how this country came to be. We tell this really beautiful story about a chosen nation, an innocent nation, and all these things that denied the suffering and the oppression and the pain that's been caused, the lives that have been destroyed to create what exists now today and continues to destroy lives in the process. So we've got to do a cultural shift of telling more truthful stories so that maybe one day we can be like Germany, where it's not okay to have, Nazi statues being celebrated in the streets. But until we're willing to actually grapple and look in the mirror as a nation, as a people, I think we can't get there. And so we've got a lot of work to do on the cultural level as well, so that we can be honest about this nation, its origins, and maybe then redirecting it.